The coral reef at the edge of Seabreeze Lagoon had been dying for 2 seasons, slowly, the way beautiful things die when the conditions that made them possible quietly disappear. The bleaching had moved in from the deep water first, the vivid purple and orange and gold of the outer reef going white in patches that the divers who studied it marked on their maps with increasing urgency, and then the shallows had followed, until the lagoon that had once been the kind of place people crossed oceans to see had become a ghost of itself, white and still and quiet where it had once been riotous with color and life. Vaporeon had lived in the lagoon for 3 years and remembered what it had been. It remembered the way the light used to move across the living coral in the late afternoon, a shifting kaleidoscope that it had sometimes hovered in simply to watch. It remembered the particular sound of a reef at full health, the clicks and pops and rush of water through 1,000 living structures. And it was the absence of that sound, the flat silence of the bleached shallows, that had finally moved the Vaporeon from grief to purpose. It started at the deepest section of the inner reef, where a small cluster of coral had survived the bleaching by virtue of a cold freshwater spring that bubbled up from the seafloor nearby, and it began to work. Acid armor first, not to protect itself, but to change its own cell chemistry, to make the healing energy that Vaporeon carried in its body into something the coral's own biology could receive. The process was slow, and it had learned not to rush it. It moved through the shallows at the pace of the water itself, its fan tail trailing spirals of blue-white light that settled over the bleached coral branches and sank in. Where the light touched, color returned, not immediately, not dramatically, but in the patient way that real healing works, the coral's own living processes resuming under the Vaporeon's encouragement. It worked for 6 days without leaving the lagoon, sleeping in brief intervals in the freshwater spring's cold upwelling, eating only what the lagoon itself offered. The seventh morning, a diver came down from the research station on the headland and found the Vaporeon in the shallows, still working, its body slightly less brilliant than when it had started, the energy it carried visibly lower. The diver didn't approach. She filmed everything she saw and surfaced and told the others, and they came down one by one and treaded water above the shallows and watched. By the end of the second week, the inner quarter of the reef was in color. That fully recovery didn't work that way, but the first flush of pink and amber and pale gold had returned to the coral branches that had been white, and with it the first small fish had come back to the shallows, darting through the new growth with the quick confidence of creatures returning to a place they had always meant to be. On the 15th day, the Vaporeon surfaced in the center of the lagoon at sunset, its body low in the water, exhausted in a way it had not been before. The research team was on the dock above it, watching. One of them, the youngest, an intern who had come to the station specifically to study the bleaching, sat down at the dock's edge and put her hand just above the water's surface, not reaching in, just offering. Vaporeon swam to the dock and looked up at her for a long moment, then it touched its nose to her palm, made a soft liquid sound that carried across the still water, and dove. The lagoon closed over it without a ripple. On the seafloor below, in the last light of the evening filtering down through the clear water, the reef that had been silent for 2 seasons was not silent anymore.